Hey everybody, welcome to Friday Night Writes, a podcast about writing. My name's Fuzz, with me as always is Jonesy.
Hey everyone.
Tonight we're going to talk about writing a horror story, or many a horror story. We're going to talk about how to pull all that stuff together, and just in time for Halloween. But before that, we're going to get to some stuff that we're going to, what we've got planned coming up for next month, with it being NaNoWriMo and all.
It is next month, so starting November 1st, NaNoWriMo kicks off. That's the National Novel Writing Month. It's an organization that's devoted to everybody pulling together and writing novels during the month of November. So the goal is to, if you've never heard of it, the goal is to put together 50,000 words in the month of November, which, if you're terrible at math like I am, that boils down to about 1,667 words a day, 30 days in November. So the idea is that you, by the end of November, you've written a novel, or something that could pass as a novel, or something that is novel-sized, basically. And each of us have talked, we're going to give it a shot this year. I'm going to write. We talked about last time on the podcast about telling stories serially and as if they're like a season of a television show. And my commitment is to write the first season of the Memoirs of Eli Grigsby storyline, which we've talked about a little bit before. But it's a story of a guy who he becomes a host to a reaper and a guardian angel. And in this world, reapers exist and guardian angels exist, but they don't usually use the same person as a host. So there's that conflict, and each of the spirits, for lack of a better term, are different. They're different types of people. And so it's like a guy talking to voices in his head all the time. And so far I've had fun developing it and writing it, but I got a little bit of world building to do. I got a little bit of outlining to do ahead of November 1st, which we're, less than a week away from. So by the time we post this, it'll be right around the corner. So how about you? Are you, Fuzz, are you gearing up to do something for NaNoWriMo?
Yeah, I've been kind of picking away at doing it for the last few years. I'm signed up and I get the incessant emails all year round. Yeah, this time I think I'm going to do either a short Autumnville story, or I might do something in the science fiction sort of setting, or I might just go in completely blind and on November 1st just start typing and see where it takes me. I don't really know yet. I'm always kind of nervous about doing stuff where, you sort of publish stuff through another website, because I don't want to do the stuff that I really want to publish myself, put it on another website, and then find out that there's some trickery in the fine,
fine print.
Yeah, the fine print saying, you can't do this, or, this becomes the property of. So I'm not really sure, but once I get started, it should be a breeze. 1,600 words a day is not that big of a deal.
No.
So
it's really not when you break it down into the chunks like that.
Yeah.
When you start falling behind a day or two of your writing, that's when it really looms over you. But the idea isn't necessarily to put together something that's publishable.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's just the idea is to devote to a writing habit for 30 days. And at the end of that 30 days, look back and say, hey, I wrote enough to have a novel.
Yeah.
So I have 50,000 words here. It's a story. It may be awful. It may be full of beholds and everything like that. But It's a story. It's 50,000 words, and I did that.
Yeah.
So
I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that, when you're doing NaNoWriMo, in a lot of cases, if you take, say a week or two before the process starts, before November 1st, and you just jot down some notes, try and invent some characters, and maybe pull together a couple of settings, sets for your characters to move around in and stuff, and you approach it, as you would approach just about any writing project, really, and try to attack it by doing between 2,000 and 2,500 words a day, 5 days a week. You're not necessarily going to stay above that 1,600 a day number, when everything is said and done, but you're still going to be close enough, and you're going to be able to really kind of pump out something that you're really interested in and still have a couple of days off. Because that's the thing that always bugged me. The first year that I did NaNoWriMo, it made me crazy because I had to keep up a 7-day-a-week work habit on it. And at the time, real life was just, it was pumping. I had 1,000,001 things going on. So, getting the opportunity to sit down every day and do 1,600 and some odd words a day, sometimes it was just impossible. And, or I just wasn't motivated to do it. And, so when I went in the next year to do it, like I told you before, that first day I cranked out about 25,000 words just to make sure that I was way ahead of the curve, and then I just never went back to it. Yeah. And I was just completely, just oblivious to it. I kept figuring, I'll get back to it. I'm so far ahead. I've got tons of time. And, it turns out that just wasn't the case. So, I think that you can pace yourself around 2,500 words a day for 5 days a week, and then get a solid 2 days where, you can actually kind of reflect on what you've done and all that stuff. And you still stay at least reasonably on track. Yeah.
Yeah, at 2,500 words a day, you would be, or for 5 days a week,
yeah.
Giving yourself a couple of days off, you would be on pace,
yeah.
At least to hit your goal. That you mentioned the magic word motivation in there, and I've been reading, about motivation for a lot of years, and I've always been looking for motivation when I write and stuff, and that's a part of what's cool about this program, is that you understand going in that the motivation to write doesn't matter. You have to do this amount of words per day.
Yeah.
If you're motivated or not. And, Chuck Wendig had a post, I think this week, about motivation and about how sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. And if you want to write, you have to write on the days that it's there, and you have to write on the days that it's not. And I think that, doing that for 30 days or for 26 days or whatever, 22 days, whatever, if you're building a habit, at the end of November, you might just have yourself a writing habit. Or you might just sit back and say, that was awful.
Yeah.
That was brutal.
Yeah, never touching this again.
Yeah. I don't want to write anything ever again. But at the end of the 30 days, maybe also
you have something to show for it.
Yeah, you'll have something to show for it, and you can sit back and you can say, I wrote 1,600 words a day for 30 days. There's no reason that I can't do that for the next 30 days.
Yeah.
And then, you get to the next 30 days and you say the next 30 days after that. That's the power of habit. So it's a cool program. We're both going to get into it this year, and we each plan on posting daily updates on FridayNightWrites.net, and that way that we can kind of keep everybody abreast of how we're doing. So we will post updates on the blog there. They will cross-post to Facebook, and we'll be able to keep everybody apprised of what's going on with Friday Night Writes, or with our NaNoWriMo sprints and on the FridayNightWrites.net website. One other thing that we wanted to get out of the way before we jumped into the depths of horror is that we're going to start referring to this podcast as less of a writing podcast and more of a storytelling podcast.
Yeah.
Because we found that in the past 2 sessions that we've had together just talking that, we talk a lot about the writing process, but as much as anything, we're talking about storytelling.
Yeah.
We're diverging into subjects on pop culture and stories like Star Wars and Harry Potter and all this stuff. And we thought that it's better to say, hey, we're talking about storytelling.
Yeah.
So we can talk about television. We can talk about movies. We're not just going to talk about books all the time.
Yeah. And we can talk about music. We can talk about visual storytelling. We can talk about art and all kinds of other interesting stuff, which is kind of the plan. It was kind of the original intention. But, when we first kind of came up with this idea, it was, let's do something on the hero's journey. And, once you start on that roll, you sort of have an obligation to follow it up with, the other bare bones basics, which I think we've covered. Certainly not extensively, but we've covered, the bare bones you're not going to get a better template than the 3-act structure.
No. And
you're not going to get anything better than the hero's journey if you want to write something epic and huge. So I think we've covered our ground nicely on that stuff, and now it's just time to branch off and do something that's going to be a little more fulfilling for all of us. So
yeah. So that's a little bit of the news about the podcast. I'll just quickly update you on the website. We're at FridayNightWrites.net. We're a community about writing and people who are interested in learning to write or interested in talking about writing, getting a conversation going. What we like to do is post a prompt every week and then, come back at the end of the week and everybody has posted a story around that prompt, and then we kind of can set up or start some conversation on the website about these stories and what the prompt was about and what we struggled with and all this kind of stuff. So we're trying to get a conversation started about writing fiction specifically and about storytelling. So we're at FridayNightWrites.net. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/FNWrites. And we are on Twitter at FNWrites, but I haven't done much on there yet.
Yeah,
just posted about podcasts.
Yeah, I haven't messed with it. So,
but the goal is to get more conversation on the website. That's what we're after. So please join us. If you hear this, you like the podcast, go visit FridayNightWrites.net. Ready to talk about horror?
Yeah, I think it's about that time.
All right.
So, horror. What you have in horror is a lot of different kinds of little subgenres that ultimately break down the different kinds of stories you can write or kind of stories you can tell. But before we go into that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of aside for a second. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine on Facebook the other night about degrees, and it's something that I think everybody kind of has a basic understanding of, but it's not necessarily something that a lot of people kind of codified. And it's basically the idea that every story that you're ever going to write is going to be based on a certain level of degrees away from normal. So if normal is 0, then 1, the first degree, might be something along the lines of, in horror, might be something along the lines of a Michael Myers sort of killer, somebody who is still definitively in real life, but just slightly off. It's not 0 degree. It's not the real world. But it is just a little bit off, but it's still close enough. And so then what you get is the sort of drastic change, which would be maybe something like a 6 degree. Might be something like the old full moon horror films, like Puppet Master and things like that, about magic puppets who are brought to life by taking out people's brain goo and giving these little critters life, and each one of them running around doing their own thing. But all stories are kind of based in that idea. Sci-fi tends to start at about a 3 or 4 degree, which is, I think, one of the reasons why a lot of people just aren't fans of sci-fi, because it does take a certain degree of unbelief or acceptance of the incredible to even begin to fall in line with it.
Right.
And obviously certain things like cartoons, some television shows, depending on how they're built, like say a Supernatural, Sam and Dean running around killing monsters. It doesn't, for the first several seasons, it was very much like a degree 1 or 2 kind of story. It was very close to the real world, but just a little bit enough that it had some fantasy and it was enjoyable. And then when the angels and all the other stuff sort of kicked in, it sort of upped the ante a bit and became a little crazier. But by that time, it had already had its fan base, and if you were in, you were in.
Yeah.
So
and you were watching at that point in time to watch Sam and Dean more than you were watching the Monster of the Week thing.
Yeah, and the idea of degrees is obviously it's in anything that you're going to write or that you're even going to conceive of. And that is one of the things that you can sort of use as a sort of litmus test to decide just how many people you're actually going to be able to reach with your story. Because, if you're writing, say, CSI stuff, Alex Cross stuff, you're writing, in those, sort of Tom Clancy universes where you're maybe 1 or 2 steps off from the real world, it's still real easy to understand. You can easily fall in line with that stuff. But then if you turn around and you jump into like Clive Barker, Imagica and stuff like that, that's like 10 degrees away. I mean, it's like, hey, here's a magic world in a carpet. Get that through your head. And now, and so like...
We don't have a jumping off point.
Right. And so like it's really hard, and that's one of the reasons why almost all those stories uses a sort of everyman as a gateway for you to walk into these stories. And it tends to be the crazier the story is, the more kind of humble and normal your lead character has to be in order to bring you into the sort of psychosis of this other world.
Yeah.
One of the things that kind of brings me to it again is a science fiction movie, but it was the Jupiter Ascending, which is a great movie. It's fantastic. Visually, it's gorgeous. The storyline was really fun. One of the things that I loved about it was that the main heroine, she doesn't throw a single punch. It's not. I mean, it's an action movie, but it's not like what you expect from the Matrix guys.
Right.
But yeah, the one of the things to think about before you start writing horror is degrees. To sort of decide just how far away from the real world this story is going to be. Because the further away it is, genuinely, the harder it is for people to kind of grasp a hold of it. It's one of the things I struggle with in Autumnville a lot, because I have a lot of genuine fantasy elements to it. I mean, the idea of these zones that you can sort of find magic doors that will let you cross between worlds and things like that. It's a real kind of hard idea to just sort of lay out there. You can just sort of slam it down on the table, throw your hands up and walk away and go, you're either in or you're out.
Right.
But you also have, as a writer, you also have this kind of desire to really explain it so that your reader isn't asking questions consistently, going, wait a minute, what the hell was that? What is this? How does this work? Why does this work?
Well, the idea of the everyman, like you said, and drawing people into this world that way. The other technique you can use, or that has been used effectively, and which you use a little bit in Autumnville from what I've read, because I came at Autumnville, I didn't understand what the zones were, but I knew a lot of the characters, so I was already invested, right? But that Wizard of Oz moment, landing in Oz, she opens the door, and it's not sepia anymore. It's full of color. It's vibrant.
Yeah.
So immediately, the viewers are immersed into that experience. So they're still following their everyman, Dorothy, but they're now into this world that looks completely different. And now, if you're building your story as a novel, then you don't necessarily have that. You don't have that visual trigger you can kick off like that. But that's used similarly, I think, is following the everyman into whatever rabbit hole you're going down.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that makes the idea of degrees, which isn't necessarily something that you need to write down or anything like that, it's just kind of something to kind of keep in mind, is that the further away from reality you get, the more kind of niche your story becomes. And there's nothing wrong with targeting a small group of people. There's people out there who are into people putting on gigantic Godzilla costumes and performing all kinds of weird sexual acts on film, and they are a genuinely real subgenre, and they cut film together and do all kinds of weird stuff, but it's a real thing. And if those are the people that you choose to write for, there may only be a couple of hundred of these people.
Yeah.
But if that's who you're going for, then by God, go for that crew. Don't shy away from what you're looking to your target audience. But at the same time, you have to remember that if you're, the further away from that 0 degree you get, the harder it is to pull in, more of an audience.
Yeah. The smaller your audience, the further from 0 you get, the smaller your audience will be.
But another truth that's kind of that goes with that is that the smaller the audience is, the more fanatical they're going to be, and a lot of people, don't really realize that, and that's something that we see every day nowadays, especially in film, is, every time there's a new Transformers movie that comes out, that comedy bit with, I'm forgetting his name, but, he's just oh, did you see Transformers? Yeah, it sucked. Everybody's so jaded by this kind of stuff, and it's you put yourself in a position where if you try and write for everyone, then you're just going to get hammered. Just the negativity becomes exponential.
Right.
Which is one of the things that kind of makes me crazy, is that, I would love to be able to sit down and write a story like an Autumnville, and to have it become like a universal kind of, tale, something like a Harry Potter or something like that. I mean, it'll never happen, but, by utilizing degrees, keeping that in mind, you can sort of adjust those settings at times, so that in the beginning of the book, I don't necessarily want to go too crazy with the supernatural. I want to sort of slow burn it. So the good first huge chunk of the book is very much like a degree 0 or degree 1, and then it sort of jumps into these different degrees at different times. So, but it always falls back on that degree 0, because that's sort of where I want to build off of is the real world. But that's just kind of an aside. I just wanted to throw that out there in case. I know that it's something that a lot of writers have used, or I know that it's stuff that you hear people say occasionally, but you rarely hear it kind of codified as like a tool to sort of gauge where you're going to go. But as far as horror goes and the types of horror, you have sociological, which generally is the breakdown of society. It is, zombies, it's...
Your 28 Days Later.
Yeah,
your Walking Dead.
Yeah, it's where everything just kind of goes to hell. Psychological is the loss of sanity and self-control. That's where you get into stuff like, critters that can control your mind and all kinds of stuff like that. Allegorical is arguably the oldest, and it's that just fear of being eaten. It's the monster in the closet that's going to eat you. Scientific is something that you see a lot. Transcendence was a very recent film that kind of dealt with this idea of someone uploading their consciousness into the sort of digital ether and then becoming something, genuinely disturbing. But it also falls in line with stuff like Frankenstein playing God and testing those sort of, not necessarily moral, but those sort of ethereal boundaries of what belongs to God, what belongs to man, and not really trying to...
the consequences always,
yeah.
Of playing God or messing with nature even.
Yeah. And then you have the supernatural, which essentially the trick of the supernatural is that it has no rational explanation, and that's the horror of it stems from that you can't attack it with science, and that's kind of something that's changed recently, where most of these stories do tend to kind of attack the supernatural from a scientific perspective, which is kind of a shame because it does sort of disrupt the genuine horror of what the supernatural can be. And then you have natural stuff, which is natural horror is the sort of threats that you would genuinely see in the real world. It's what was that movie years and years ago with Jeremy Piven and Dennis Leary with Judgment Night?
Oh yeah.
Where it's just like some group of suburban guys that end up in some god awful
they're at like a bachelor party,
yeah,
and they end up in the hood, and for some reason Dennis Leary is the king of the gangsters.
Yeah.
Judgment Night.
Yeah.
Emilio Estevez.
Yeah. And natural horror can also be anything from natural disasters, volcanoes going off, or LA just sort of collapsing into the ocean,
San Andreas.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of stories, whether they be film or television or books, they tend to kind of get labeled as far as their genre goes. Like San Andreas, that's a horror movie. 2012, as goofy as that movie was a horror movie. The idea is to inspire fear, and that kind of gets us into our next little bit, is inspiring fear with your story is it's tough because you know what scares you, but there's also a kind of natural tendency to deny the things that genuinely horrify us, especially in men. We have that tendency of sort of saying, I ain't afraid of no ghost kind of thing, no matter what it may be. And, and a lot of times you don't really kind of probe your own kind of fear. The things that, you're a family man, so, obvious fears for you are centered around the kids, things like that. But, there are other deeper rooted psychological things. We've all seen, and I know this is going to make sense to almost nobody in the podcast, but we've all seen Brent deal with a spider. And the woo, 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 the just the way he loses his mind when he's confronted by them. And it's things like that sort of completely irrational just terror of something.
Well, but even those fears that you deny because I ain't afraid of no ghosts.
Yeah.
Like, I just moved into a new house that's really old, and sometimes it makes some noises that you don't know what they are, but they're natural. But that first night that I slept here, I slept with the bathroom light on upstairs, just outside my room, so that just in case. I know for a fact nothing's coming out of a closet or anything like that, but for some reason I was still spooked enough that I had to leave a light on all night. That's what you're talking about. It's irrational fear almost. It's fear of the dark almost too, which is like an evolutionary problem basically.
It's one of those things that's built into us to keep us alive.
Yeah, exactly. It's a survival.
And one of the things about inspiring fear is that, and we'll dig into this throughout the rest of the podcast, but inspiring fear is, it's hearing a sound and there being nothing rational that caused it, and I'm not talking about, giant clown monsters or werewolves or vampires or anything like that. That's sort of codified kind of mythology. Those are ways that we explain or explained things that we didn't understand, but now we kind of do understand them. But the mythology of them is so kind of deliciously it's such a juicy concept, like the vampire and the werewolf, that they still keep going. The idea of the witch. There was that poor, those girls just was the last week that were killed for being witches in some East Indian village or something. Those fears are still very, very, they're still prevalent. They're still out there. But in our world, they are all things that can be explained through psychology or, biology, things like that.
But it's still, that is those personifications or those myths that were drawn up came from a place where we were the apex predator. And we were ignorant of a phenomenon. Yes.
And then we created.
So we became prey.
Yeah.
And that's scary as hell to humans because we've never been prey.
Yeah. Or at least we haven't for
a long years. Time.
And, in that kind of vein, one of the things to remember whenever you're kind of starting to craft a story that's going to be in the horror genre is that fear of, like you had brought up earlier with that H.P. Lovecraft quote, and there's never been a truer thing said in horror ever than that line of, the most...
It's the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown.
Yeah. And that falls perfectly into the fear of the dark, the fear of the neighbor who you don't know, the fear of the mailman, all these different things of, what you don't know, what you don't have a natural kind of understanding of. And, the keeping that as like a theme when you're at least in that sort of Bibling stage where you're crafting your story and you're writing it up, it's always something to keep in mind. Also, to keep in mind the most common fears of people. The biggest fear that affects everyone, well, not everyone, but affects the most people is the idea of speaking in front of a lot of people. It's like the biggest fear that's out there. And then, you sort of fall into, like, I don't remember what the second one was now, but like the third one was arachnophobia. And then the next one was like, claustrophobia came in very shortly thereafter, and agoraphobia, or acrophobia and agoraphobia, all those things. But to keep that idea alive of understanding what common fears are, for a lot of people, they mistake gross out for fear. A lot of people would never in their right mind put their hands, down a sink because they have no idea what's down there. In their mind, it's that scene from Temple of Doom where she's putting her hand through the thing and there are bugs everywhere, like your brain just sort of creates the most horrible thing that you can conceive of. And that's actually what you want to do, is to sort of utilize the most common fears.
Think about how many stories in the genre have centered around the old story, the call was coming from within the house, right? So it's the fear that somebody or something is in your house, in your space. Like there's all those movies that came out a few years ago, like The Strangers.
Yeah.
And I won't even watch them because that is, for me, somebody breaking into my house while I'm sleeping or something and be really quiet about it, I'm like,
yeah,
that just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up just now.
Yeah.
Just even saying it. So like that's a common fear. Aside from even all those defined ones, you see time and again all kinds of horror stories. All of them go back to that same well of somebody being in your home that's not supposed to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, see, for me, stuff like that was ruined when I saw the trailer for the sinister coterie of Midnight Intruders. Like I could never take any of those seriously again. Wow. But yeah, but another thing that you want to do, which this sounds horrible, but it is something that you want to consider, which is kind of the Stephen King method, where you victimize your reader. And that's where you sort of you subject characters to the kind of humiliations and the kind of real world sort of bodily intrusion that all people kind of are afraid of to some degree. Like when you watch or read Dreamcatcher.
Yeah.
The toilet scene in that is just incredibly uncomfortable. The scene in It where, she's in the bathroom and Pennywise is sort of, tormenting her. And the things that he's saying are incredibly difficult for a reader to just kind of shrug off, because they're things that have to do with, with your body and with, elements of your body that you may not be comfortable dealing with. And in recent years, that's sort of the idea of victimizing your reader or viewer has become called, or has sort of the cool term for it now is torture porn. But I think that is sort of a kind of crass generalization, and it diminishes the original intent and effect of what that's for. If you're going to victimize your reader, then you're putting them in the state of empathizing with your characters to the point where the degradation and the horror and the in some cases sadistic or whatever things that they're being subjected to, that you feel it too, or that you're in a position where you're forced to kind of visualize it as well and kind of empathize and understand it. And that's one of the hardest things to do as a writer, because it is genuinely tough. I mean, the idea of utilizing, say a rape scene in a horror story, you can't really approach that idea lightly. You're forced to just sort of try to understand what's happening here on all different levels, where the aggressor and where the victim are kind of meeting in the middle, and what's going on. And and in a lot of cases, by victimizing the reader, you are victimizing yourself as the writer, because you do have to be able to understand both of their motivations there. And but it is something that as a writer you should do. If you're trying to write horror, or you're trying to craft a story that is scary, that is genuinely scary, you want to find out what inspires fear in others and what inspires fear in yourself, and you want to then kind of understand what are the common fears that I deal with, what are the common fears that others deal with, being alone, being underestimated. That's a big thing, especially in today's kind of workplace, the idea of being underestimated, that's such a horrible thing to do to someone, and then the idea of victimizing the reader into being able to empathize, as opposed to just sort of coming along for the ride, and it's something that horror film has failed in so much. The idea of victimizing the viewer, torture porn, like the Eli Roth stuff, to some degree, because they show the penetration of a knife going into someone, or they show you the things that make you kind of pucker up and not really be able to move for a minute or
right.
two, and that's all well and good, because that's a tactic to victimize your viewer. But then you go back and you look at, say, like a film like Saw, or you go and you look at the original Chainsaw Massacre, and there's no, people at the time lost their mind at Chainsaw. oh, it's so gory, it's so horrible, blah blah blah. There's no gore in it at all. You know, you don't. I mean, there's a lot of disturbing imagery, skulls and all kinds of things, but that's the point. There's nothing gory about this, and a lot of films followed suit. But then, of course, once that ball gets rolling, you have to. There's escalation. Yeah, you have to escalate, and that's where I think a lot of the stuff went wrong.
Well, I think that Saw. You brought up Saw because it was the same type of genesis as Chainsaw was, but for the torture porn movie, and that first one was masterful. Yeah, it was just tense the whole way through. And then you had your cringeworthy moment at the very end of it. Yeah. Where you're just like, yeah. And then your mind explodes at what happens. And there's nothing crazy. There's nothing gross.
There's no supernatural. There's no nothing. It's just, it's a real world sort of thing. It's very comic booky, but they do it so well that you don't even consider it. But as far as horror goes, it's one of the last attempts, I think, that really succeeded well beyond. I mean, for me, the Paranormal Activity movies are just so wonderfully fun to watch because they're just unbelievably scary. And, it's because the threat is invisible, but it does hold physical space. And that's one of the things that makes it so interesting is that it's set in the real world, but at the same time it has this one singular fantastic element that's outside of the norm. Right. And every time it does something, its effects are just mind-blowing. And I absolutely adore watching those movies. That I could watch them not at night, but I mean I could watch them all the time. I enjoy them. But what you kind of get once you have kind of grasped the ideas of inspiring fear, utilizing common fears, and victimizing your reader is this idea of corruption. And this is where you dip into the kind of horror that your protagonist doesn't necessarily emerge unscathed from. And it's the idea where you can have multiple kinds of corruption: biological, psychological, moral corruption, and each one of those is kind of obvious. Biological corruption is, taking it to a little goofy level is, where you run into like the Toxic Avenger and goofy stuff like that, where you are physically altered because of the things that you've encountered. The psychological one is, again, fairly obvious. You develop aberrant thought processes because of your exposure to the things that you've dealt with. And moral are, again, obvious. You become less able to maintain a moral guide, a moral perspective. Yeah.
Your worldview has changed.
Yeah. And a lot of that you can sort of kind of commit that the idea of corruption along the same lines as what policemen or soldiers have to deal with, who deal with high concentrations of combat, or dealing with people who are basically degenerate, and
just the stress of those situations.
Yeah, it's not outside of the boundaries of reality to say, that biological, psychological, and moral corruption can happen, because we see it happen all the time. Whenever you hear about a real life serial killer, psychological and moral corruption is almost intrinsic to their process of their transformation into becoming a human predator. And and that's one of the things that makes them so terrifying to us, is because, like what you said, is that we're apex predators, at least in theory. And so anything that preys on us, even if it's another one of our own kind, tends to get elevated to a different kind of perspective. And again, corruption is the core of all of those things. When you think back to John Wayne Gacy, Pogo the Clown, and all the bodies that were found beneath his home. You think to, what's his name? Oh God, the recent one. No, not recent one, but the one in the 90s.
Dahmer?
Yeah, Dahmer. Dahmer was another, moral corruption. He was someone who was dealing with, not understanding his own sexuality, and then developing this weird sort of kind of unnatural sort of rote sort of mythology based around his sexuality, so that in order for him to be able to feel close to another human being, he had to cut them up and put them in his fridge. I mean, that's how do you get there?
Yeah, there's yeah, whatever steps are missing there. That's and the corruption thing across any of those you think about, where whichever one it is, if it's psychological or moral, but you go through the history of those, and in every one of them you're like, the same question, for me and you, or for anybody, we cannot possibly identify with their perspective.
Yeah.
And that's a part of what Lovecraft, the fear of the unknown. We have no clue. We cannot possibly understand where things went wrong.
Yeah.
Where the train went off the rails.
Yeah.
So we don't see a motivation. We don't see a motivator. We don't know.
Yeah.
We just see them as monsters.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, though, that as the writer, that you do kind of have to address that idea, because your antagonists are so important that, it is tough, because when you do stand on the edge of that precipice and you're about to jump down that rabbit hole where you're going to develop an antagonist that is genuinely horrific, you have to be willing to subject yourself to trying to understand what those people were thinking.
Yeah. And
the processes that brought them to those places that turned them into the things that they became. And I have that in here on my notes as inspiring toxicity. Because the best horror, the best terror, the best delivery systems of things that scare people don't just scare you, make you laugh, to shrug it off, and then let you walk away. It's that childish part of us that remembers, has bad dreams about it, that causes us to wake up in the middle of the night and be sweaty, and your heart's pumping, and you're and you're freaking out, and you don't know why, and that's the thing, is that you want to, with your storylines, you want to inspire a degree of toxicity that can jump from page to person. You want it to affect them. And and it may sound like you're trying to, like that I'm trying to convince you to write a story that's going to deeply screw someone up, but that's not what I'm trying to convey. But it's just the idea that dealing with horror should never leave you unscathed, because that's what it is in real life. You see a horrible car accident, you can't just shrug that off.
No.
You see, a bear jump out of the woods and take some dude down. You don't giggle and walk away. It's not like watching your buddy walk down the street and he falls flat on his face. You can laugh your ass off about that for hours. But he got up and he walked away from it. If he's walking along and somebody runs up and knifes him 36 times and runs off, and you didn't get a good look at the guy. You're just stunned by the moment. No one has any idea what happened. No one saw the guy. Now you've got a victim, and they're not the only one that were just victimized. Everyone who watched that was now victimized, because they're going to have to come to grips with that. And that's kind of the toxicity that I'm talking about. Like, you want your antagonists to leave a little bit behind, so that every time someone brings that antagonist up, people go, man, that dude. You almost want people in the real world to look at your fantasy characters as, the Candyman. Like, they don't want to say his name because he scared the shit out of them that much.
Yeah.
And that's not easy work to do, but it can be done. It can be done. You have to go back and you have to look at how you can inspire fear, the common fears that everyone has, and how to victimize the reader.
And this is no different than any other story you're trying to tell.
No.
So you always want to leave your consumer or your reader, whatever, with a takeaway.
Yeah.
You want them to remember your characters or remember your story.
Yeah.
And then in the case of horror, the idea is to inspire fear, or to inspire people to look at the world differently, maybe, but to do that, to instill a fear in them that say, hey, things can get crazy.
Yeah.
And there's traumatic situations.
Yeah.
And this is what they may look like. And if you're really in one, then it's going to be a lot worse, obviously. But this is a facsimile of what that's like.
Yeah. And just consider for a moment the trauma that the book 1984 caused and has continued to cause ever since it came out, of its sort of depiction of the Big Brother, society, and other things like say Dr. Moreau is another thing that it's lost maybe some of its validity, but for a long time, the idea of hybridizing men and animals was a genuine fear. Not the same kind that was addressed in 1984. But
Jurassic Park again, yeah, the same kind of idea. It's that could you imagine if some asshole, built a T-Rex? And then was just like, hey, built a T-Rex. You'd be like, you're an asshole. Get out of here.
You're like, why would you do this?
Go live on the island with them.
That's just, just ridiculous. But, the idea of the trauma that you're sort of infected with it on a day-to-day basis, especially now with the way that the news gets disseminated, because if you sit down and you watch the nightly news and you're of any degree connected to the net over the course of the day, and you check any normal events, by the time you sit down to watch the news, they're just telling you things that you learned about before lunch. In most cases, they're just showing you highlights of what you've already read about in more detail than they can give you. And now with all the horrible weather that's going on, and you hear about people being swept away in their homes and and things like that, and it's like, that's real trauma, that's real horror that people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. No one's going to swoop in and hand these folks a check for a couple of $1 million and say, go fix your life. Nobody's planning on doing that, and that's kind of one of the things that you again need to consider when you're going to craft a horror story.
But that's this may take us off of course a little bit, but this works. Horror works. We like horror. Humans do. Mm-hmm. That is all the nightly news is.
Yeah.
It is nothing but a play on your fears. Because if you were to watch the nightly news every day and just believe that that's how the world was, you'd want to go home and end it.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing happy. There's nothing positive.
Yeah.
Everything's doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And we're watching that because we respond to it viscerally somehow, where we say, ugh, man, this is how bad things can get.
Yeah.
And that's.
But one of the things that you always do when you watch the news is you say, "Thank God that didn't happen to me."
Exactly. Exactly. And they're not dummies. They know what people want to see.
Oh yeah.
What people respond to, and that's what they put on the television for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's playing on those same primal instincts or those same primal fears. The unknown, the man, that would be awful if it happened to me, all of that kind of stuff that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. That's why it sells so well.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of the kind of genesis of horror is just that idea that the world is it's everything's swirling around the toilet bowl. It's just a matter of time before we go down the drain. And that's what the news sort of puts out there. And of course they throw in their happy, feel good story.
Every once in a while.
Yeah. And but a lot of that is because fear sells.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had a day where there wasn't ISIS blowing up some ancient marvel, that is some priceless, irreplaceable thing that those assholes aren't just, eradicating, then, there's some idiot with a gun running in and shooting up a Walmart or God only knows what, And when you're crafting a horror story, it can be that simple. You don't have to necessarily go out of your way to work up some kind of supernatural content or anything like that. You can
boogeyman.
Yeah, you can just create an asshole with a gun. God knows they're all over the place, and but that kind of brings us to the two sort of styles of horror. These aren't really genres as much as they are like a style. You have precise horrors, which targets the psychological weaknesses, targets loved ones, it creates suspicion. It forces characters to operate in shades of gray or against their nature. It uses threats of violence to motivate and kind of force characters to capitulate, that kind of thing. And then you have broad horror, which is just kind of evil for the sake of evil. You use gore, you use murder, and it tends to be black and white in regards to morality. There's always a good guy, there's always a bad guy, and it's just that simple. It's never too much more than that. Whereas precise horror really keeps in that range of gray tones, where the good guy usually ends up doing some pretty horrible things, and the bad guy might do some very, very positive things in the course of doing his profound horror in the end. I mean, you could almost say that it, to a degree, that Mr. Robot is precise horror. And whereas like broad horror, that's, that was
I think a lot of your traditional, when you say horror, a lot of your traditional things are going to fall under that broad horror spectrum. But then, your psychological thrillers, or things that are now too cool to be called horror. What comes to mind when I just thinking of this definition is the movie Seven. That is exactly what that is. And I think you get more into layered psychological horror, stuff like that, with the precise horror definition.
Yeah, definitely. And then what you get into from there is this idea of disquiet versus discomfort. This is something that we've kind of addressed before, but disquiet is hearing the car brakes squeal from up the road and then running around the corner and seeing, a child's shoe toppled over in the middle of the road, and maybe a blanket with like a splash of blood on it. That's disquieting because you are seeing the aftermath, but you really have no idea.
And you still have hope.
Yeah. Whereas discomfort is the idea that there's a body there. Same setup.
Or you see the child get hit by the car.
Yeah, it's the same setup, but what you see is the event happen, and you're forced to sort of take that in. And that's discomforting. Disquiet versus discomfort is it is a constant battle when you're trying to write horror, because sometimes you do want to show off what the capabilities of your antagonist are. And if you have a scene with, say, a werewolf, you have to at least once show that this thing is physically commanding. It can outrun you, it can outfight you, it can outstand you. No matter what you throw at it, it just shrugs it off. If you don't, then it's just, it's
is
not,
it even a werewolf?
Yeah, it's not really that intimidating.
Right.
So you sort of have to play that balancing act of disquiet versus discomfort. And personally, I like to stay with disquiet. I think disquiet works better than discomfort. But I like to use disquiet in conversation. So, because a lot of my characters in Autumnville are very close friends, it's easy for me to have them have off-topic conversations of, dude, did you hear about this? This happened and this happened. Dude, that thing was unstoppable. And you can sort of leave it at that. You don't really necessarily have to go any further. The readers just gone, okay, this, according to this is what's going on.
Right.
And I like doing that because it's sort of, it has a dual function of fulfilling the contract between me and the reader, of me giving them the information that they need to understand what I'm trying to convey. But it also works as foreshadowing, and it gives them the setup so that later on, when the thing does appear, they have a healthy understanding that this thing is intimidating to deal with.
Well, as a pure horror technique, though, disquiet works great in any application. So whether it's visual or written,
forcing your imagination to
exactly,
do the work.
because as we said earlier, we have our own fears.
Yeah.
Me telling you a ghost story, I don't know what your fears are. So if I say something that's disquieting, your mind gets to working, and you bring your own fears to the forefront to address that. If I show you everything, you never get your own fears involved.
Yeah, it becomes traumatic when you show something.
Correct.
And that's kind of where you have those distinct styles, because it's easy to traumatize. Every time you deal with a young person, a young human being, that's one at the forefront of my mind always is going, if I say the wrong thing right now, this kid could be fucked for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And so you sort of have to keep all of those things in your mind. It's easy to traumatize, and that's where a lot of film it jumps to traumatizing. Japanese horror is so bad about that.
Yeah.
Whereas American horror does have a tendency to at least be a little more subtle. The stuff that's coming over from Britain, or that's at least British, predominantly British in actors and stuff, the new stuff that's moved in lately has been much more, much more on the disquiet side than the discomfort side. And it's really good. But once you've kind of got this idea of disquiet versus discomfort, and you've kind of figured out that balancing act that you have to play, the other thing is to remember to be vague. Telling your reader that the monster is a 30-foot tall thing that looks like a caterpillar with tentacles coming out of its face, and there's little nodes that run down its sides that are all tiny little mouths, and they're constantly gibbering in some foul, language that you don't really understand, but is something not natural and not right, and that the thing's skin has a weird sort of luminescence in the moonlight. Those are all really great things to sort of develop the idea of the monster. But once you do commit it, you do kind of ruin the thing.
Right.
Being vague is very key. Even if you're dealing with something as obvious as a vampire or a werewolf, the idea of being vague allows your reader, like what you were saying, is that they invent the horror. They invent the thing that scares them the most, And so if you sort of set that parameter by saying this is a vampire or a vampiric creature, then you sort of set the vague kind of groundwork, but you leave it undetailed, then the reader fills in those gaps to suit their own needs for fear, for horror. So being vague is very, very important. And then you get to your antagonist, and your antagonists there's nothing in any story that's more important than your villain. Your hero, everyone loves to create their heroes, but your villain is such a key element that some people go as far as to make it so that their villains are deliberately lovable. That you don't want them to die. They're gonna, but you dread that they're gonna. And one of the things that film tends to do a lot lately is to introduce the idea of a villain or a competent villain and then kill him by the end of the movie, so that by the time you've gotten to, say, the third movie, they can resurrect the first villain, the real villain, and you fight, and then your hero has to fight him again. And developing an antagonist is the exact same as developing your protagonist. But like we were saying earlier, is that this is the character that you do want to do kind of an in-depth kind of psychological review to sort of figure out where this guy comes from, what brought him to the depths of this kind of depravity, and what motivates him, why does he do what he does, and if you don't do that, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing your story a disservice, because a one-sided villain is the most pathetic and kind of boring thing that you're gonna ever watch or read.
Well, the idea is kind of simple, and this will probably lose a good portion of our audience, but in professional sports, there are these dynasty teams, right? The New York Yankees. Mm-hmm. And everybody who's not a Yankees fan hates the Yankees. Mm-hmm. They're the most successful franchise in baseball history. Mm-hmm. They're a perfect antagonist in every situation because they're so capable. Mm-hmm. They make your guy the underdog or girl or whatever, going up against the big establishment. Mm-hmm. They're the perfect antagonist. If you go through and think about most of your horror films or horror books or anything, what comes to mind first? Is it the hero everyman? Mm-hmm. It's Freddy Krueger.
Yeah.
It's Jason Voorhees.
Yeah.
It's Michael Myers. It's Pinhead. It's the antagonist. Yeah. Almost across the board. Almost 100%. Mm-hmm. Seven. It's John Doe.
Very much so, yeah.
It is that important. You need to, if you're telling a story, which most oftentimes you're going to, that's going to have an everyman doing something. If we're going on the hero's journey, the antagonist has to be formidable. Otherwise, the fantasy is gone.
Yeah.
If it's me dunking a basketball on my 8-year-old daughter, mm-hmm. I'm not the hero in that story. Yeah. That's why the antagonist is so important, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And, developing that antagonist, I've known a couple writers over the years who, when they're developing their bad guys, they'll go even further than they will with their good guys. And a lot of times they'll sit down and they'll sort of write up, maybe a couple of short paragraphs of things that they've done that were genuinely horrible, or things that they've done that makes them redeemable. But almost across the board, what people do, or what you have to do as the writer, is to build an antagonist that has enough staying power to, not just create the tension and the fear and all that stuff, but is going to make the readers come back when that character inevitably somehow gets resurrected. There's nothing cooler in horror than seeing Jason get smoked at the end of a movie, and then 5 years later, or 20 minutes later, whatever, if you've got all the movies, you go around and you turn the new one off, and he gets struck by lightning and he's alive, and now he's on a murder spree again. Why? I don't know, man.
Because people keep paying money to see these movies.
Yeah. Because they're like, he was drowned because the camp supervisors were off, making nookie, and they weren't paying attention to him. Man, I don't know if that's solid enough to have... I don't know if that's solid enough of an origin to have this supernatural, unkillable monster that just keeps coming back every few years to murder people. Like, that's pretty shaky ground, but at the same time, it works, like, people still give a shit.
Yeah.
And so once you develop that antagonist, one of the things that you want to take into account, obviously, and this goes for any story whatsoever, is your complications and the tension that those complications bring. The protagonists should be up against overwhelming odds often. As you progress through the 3-act structure, once you're into that second act and you're now in the meat and potatoes of the story, in a horror story, you want there to be more complications, and you want to ratchet up that tension level so that every complication is potentially disastrous across the board. You don't want to let your protagonist really have the time to take a deep breath. You want him on the run. You want him, without anyone to turn to. You want him or her to be, at their wit's end as much as you can keep them. And you want that tension to bleed through. There's nothing that I love better is when I'm reading a horror story and the tension starts to build, and about 10 minutes later I realize that I've just ripped through about 40 pages, and like I'm reading faster because I'm more tense.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who's a dedicated reader has experienced it. But like that's what you want out of that. You really want to craft a piece. I draw kind of as a side thing nowadays, and the way that I draw is very much in the vein of sort of sculpting what I'm going to do. I build it up from spheres and blocks and all kinds of things, and eventually it all makes sense. And when you're writing, especially writing horror, you want it to be like you're sculpting. You don't want to look at a finished piece of sculpture and be like, why do they put a donkey foot on this representation of David? That doesn't make any sense. I don't understand that. Or have what looks like what looks like a Buick coming out of where his crotch is. It would be ridiculous. You'd be like, what? Why the hell who did this? Why would you do that? And when you're writing a story, it's no different. You don't want to have one piece that's out of the norm, that's just oddball and weird. The whole thing from beginning to end, it has to have a kind of fluidity and a sort of aesthetic, a beauty that, a flow and form to it, that when it's over, you can look at the whole of the piece and say that it was good or it was bad. When I see stories, or I should say I read stories that the only thing I can remember from them are like a couple of key events, those are, I think I can say that for me personally, those stories were failures, because if I can only remember a couple of key events, then then either something's wrong with my memory, or it just didn't affect me.
Right.
And but there are other times that like I can look at full stories, like the Gunslinger, the first book of the Dark Tower series. I love that book from beginning to end, and I just think it's such a beautiful book, just as a whole. And there's tons of, I remember everything from that book. Same thing with part 7 of that series as well, the end. And there's also there's another one, All Fright. What is it? All Fright something or other. There's a Lee Martinez book about a vampire and a werewolf who are buddies, and the vampire falls in love with a ghost, and there's a girl who's summoning Cthulhu in a small town. And it's such jackassery, but it's a blast to read. It was such a fun book. It was maybe 100 pages tops. It was like reading an old Destroyer novel. And it was horror in the sense that it had a vampire and a werewolf and a witch and a ghost in it. But it really, it wasn't horror. But it had the requisite stuff in it, though. It had the tension. It had, the ratcheting of the tension, so that you were consistently reading faster and faster and faster. And and it was a good, All Fright Diner is what it's called. And it was a blast. It was a good book. But alas.
I think that there's a tendency, in this part of the story, to make things bleak, and sometimes they will, an author will make things so bleak that there's almost no hope.
Yeah.
So you're just waiting for the antagonist to kill the hero.
Yeah.
That's all you're waiting for. Just get it over with.
Yeah.
So I don't have to watch this anymore.
Yeah. Hopelessness is the ultimate sort of the end game. And it's one of those things that you do have to kind of, you have to kind of learn to command hopelessness as a writer, and control it, like you were trying to control like a flood, like a river that's gone berserk, and you have the means to control it, but you have to approach it tactically, because too much hopelessness is hopeless, and too little is, you don't create the atmosphere that you want to create. Right. One of the films that I can just kind of think of off the top of my head that I think controls tension very, very, very perfectly was the first Matrix film, because once they established the idea that the agents were everywhere and that they were nowhere simultaneously, and that if you killed an agent, you were killing a person. They were just going to leave that body that you just wrecked and jump into something else.
Right.
You're never, you can't win.
Right.
And that established a sort of degree of hopelessness, so that by the time you get to the end and you realize that, the only one who can stop them is Neo. And once he has that great transformation, and he does destroy Smith, and you see the other two look at each other and then just bolt off like a bat out of hell, that was really cool. It was a really cool moment. It wasn't a horror moment, but it was still really cool. And it controlled, that story really controlled the hopelessness in a degree that was very masterful, because it had to balance real world threat versus this sort of cybernetic, or not cybernetic, but
this
cyberspace, sort of thing. But hopelessness is ultimately a tool in a writer's, little utility belt. And if you learn to use it appropriately, then, the results are going to be fantastic. Just the idea that, understanding that bleak isn't hopeless. Bleak is gray. It's a rainy day. It's the middle of the night and the moon's out, and you're looking down a lonely street. That's bleak. It's not hopeless. And that's the thing, is that you use bleak as a way to create the scene. You use it as it's a seasoning, and too much can spoil the meal, but just the right amount is perfect. And hopelessness is the same way. Hopelessness is bleak ratcheted up to a much more kind of terrifying level, because hopelessness is one of those things that people who have gone through depression understand hopelessness to a degree that you and I will never understand. And being able to sympathize with the idea of hopelessness as a writer, and being able to convey that in terms that people, who have been affected by hopelessness, and those who haven't, both being able to put it into terms that work for everyone, so that they can say, this person knows what they're talking about, and that's, again, that is another skill that I think we've talked about before, is that you want to write in a way, like when you were talking about that story, that short story that you were written about climbing a mountain.
Yeah.
And you were saying you didn't know jack shit about mountain climbing or any of that stuff.
Right.
But you read the story and it looked like you researched the hell out of this stuff for months. And that's the trick to all of this stuff. That's what you want to be able to do, especially when you're writing in horror, is, being able to get the words right, getting it so that the reader feels like you understand this so intimately that they the reader are going to have difficulty trying to keep up with you. That's what you want. That's what you want to get to. And that's one of those things where some people might be able to pull it off with just the teeny tiniest bit of research, and other people may need months,
right,
and months and months at it. But again, crafting any story, whether it's horror or not, it just requires that you do the diligent pre-setup work. Bible it out, write it down, make some notes, buy a corkboard, stick it on your wall right over your writing area.
Make a serial killer room.
Yeah. Buy one of those big dry erase boards, Print up photos of like one of our buddies, Sean. Whenever he's working on something, he'll go through and he'll find photos of actors that he feels would be right in that role. And then he sort of assigns that actor that role as if he's crafting movies, based on his stories.
Yeah.
And, there's nothing wrong with that. Like if you're writing, and you want to put Steve Buscemi in something, which you should, everything you write should have Steve Buscemi in it, then you should do that. You shouldn't feel awkward or weird about it.
No.
It's part of the process. And, your process is going to be different from mine and different from Jonesy's and different from everybody's. But if you can pull anything out of what we're doing to make your writing life a little bit easier, then, we've done our job. So with that, I think that we'll talk about a couple of horror movies real quick, and then we'll be done.
That sounds good.
Scary movies. What do you think about that?
Well, it is Halloween season, so I think it'd be good if we just talked about our 3 favorite horror movies.
Top 3.
Probably the 2 or 3. That's probably the best way to close this thing out. I haven't read a lot of horror novels, so I probably wouldn't add much to the conversation there. But for me, I started off with Nosferatu because, it's not the best movie or anything like that because it's so old. But, I watched it recently within the last, year and a half, and just the elements of what we've been talking about, the fears, and probably even more so the fears of that time. It's all visual, and musical.
Yeah.
So it's a silent film, and just the way they used shadow, the way they used lighting, and the grotesqueness of Count Orlok really played to that fear that people would have of the unknown,
yeah.
This monstrous looking guy,
Yeah.
And I think for that reason, that's a big one. And again, there's a lot better horror movies.
Yeah.
A lot have come after it that are great and everything, but that being for the era that it's from, being one of the first films, and how popular it still is. I'm in a movie club, and it's still in the top 250 movies ranked on IMDb. I mean,
yeah, there's a lot of good reasons that it's up there. I mean, I always thought it was interesting because they couldn't get the rights to Dracula,
right.
And so they decided that they were basically going to do it anyway, but with this Count Orlok as opposed to Count Dracula.
Right.
And, and like we were talking about earlier, Shadow the Vampire, if you've ever seen that movie, which is based on Nosferatu. Yeah, the filming of Nosferatu. Such a great movie. And, for me, both of those movies go hand in hand. I cannot watch one without watching the other. But also an interesting thing for me was that I accidentally I was watching Nosferatu. I still back when I had it on VHS, and I put it in, and I knew it was a silent movie, and I was just going to sit around and draw that afternoon anyway. And so I had the stereo playing the Rob Zombie Super Sexy album, the remix album, and just by sheer luck, I turned the music on at the moment that the film started, and they worked perfectly. It was crazy that Rob Zombie worked so well with that old movie. But
so this will be the new thing. This will be the new Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great movie though. I love Nosferatu. It's one of the few silent movies that I can handle. Most of them put me to sleep pretty quick.
Yeah,
but
they're not easy to watch, all of them. I agree with that. How about you?
Well, top 3 hands down. Exorcist at number 1. Can't touch it. It's so good. Poltergeist at a very close second. And I'm drawing a blank on the third right now. I know The Omen comes in at a very close fourth. But The Exorcist, because it was a movie that got built up when I was very young. I wanted to see it, and my dad wouldn't let me. And I kept wondering why, because there were a lot of movies that were kind of, off limits for me. Gory stuff. Anything with a lot of hyper violence in it, RoboCop, all that kind of stuff. Like, that was all stuff I didn't get to see until I was much older. But Exorcist was that holy grail of scary because, you would hear people talk about it. And, especially at the time, I would hear people talk about how real it was and that it was based on a true story. And I was just like, really? Like, that's insane. And so finally, when I did get to see it, it was years later. It came out on DVD. And it was the first version that came out on DVD. And I bought it and I watched it. And it's a kind of horror that is a little more, I want to say, existential, seeing this innocent little girl, go through these horrific changes and, this horrific swing of personality and seeing what the mother has to go through and all that was just, it was horrific. And, seeing the sort of heroic efforts of the priests, what they were going through. And I mean, the effects were just mind-boggling, and of course years later when they re-released the film with all the extra footage and stuff, and we were given that opportunity to go see it, before anyone else got to see it. And we were all in the theater together and we're watching it, and she comes down the stairs upside down doing that crab walk, and like we were just screaming, grabbing each other like, oh my God, like, well, what is happening? And I mean, it was insane. It was so good. There was such, simultaneous, like those memories of seeing it with the fellas where it was just, everyone's losing their mind. And then, the private experience of seeing it and being able to be scared because I was alone, and I didn't have to put up a front because, all the other guys were around and, all that kind of stuff. It just made for this kind of perfect storm of scary. And, and then of course, when you think of The Exorcist, and if you're a fan of it, then you can sort of bring up The Exorcist 2, which was the most absurd attempt to do a sequel ever. It's one thing to have The Exorcist where that this little girl is possessed by something horrible. And then in the second film, when you find out that something horrible's name is Pazuzu, you go, well, that's a dumb name. Like, this thing is now suddenly not nearly as horrific.
Right.
And the other demon in this story is called Omicron. Okay, that sounds like a Transformer, you know? So, like, you had such a huge, monumentally awesome movie that's followed up by this ridiculous sequel that ruins everything that came before, you know, just like a flood. It just sweeps in and just wipes it all out, and you're like, this is crap. You know, but then, you know, you follow that up with Poltergeist, which is another one of those perfect storms.
Yeah, all I remember of that movie from seeing it when I was young is just that I saw it and I was like, I'll put this away forever. Yeah. I don't ever need to watch this again.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that little girl was just the personification of just pure innocence. And, you know, the way that movie unfolds was just, it was so good. It was so great. And even the new one, if you haven't had a chance to see the new one, check it out. It is so good. Sam, what's his name? Sam Rockwell.
Oh yeah.
He's
in it?
Yeah, he's Coach.
Wow.
And he's fantastic.
He's such a good actor.
It's such a good movie. And then Amityville Horror. For me, the original one doesn't really do the trick in the same way that the remake did with Ryan Reynolds. The original one is great.
That's the one I've seen.
Yeah, it's really good, but there is some weirdness with that pig thing, and you know, some of the other stuff. And I realized that they were taking, you know, again, the true life events, and they were taking what you know, the sort of psychotic that did all the killing was talking about. But like in the remake, Ryan Reynolds, the movie is really more of a sort of bird's eye view of watching a guy go crazy. I mean, there's a scene in it where he's chopping wood out back of the house, and he's losing it, and he's making his stepson hold the block of wood on the thing. And you know, this is Ryan Reynolds we're talking about, the most lovable dude in the universe, and he is being horrifically abusive to this kid, like, you know, making him hold the thing on there as he's slamming this axe through, and you're just like, holy crap, like, this kid's face is like inches away from this axe coming down, and it's watching a guy lose his mind. And then, you know, when you know, and they dig into the lore and stuff like that, and it was really cool the way that they sort of put everything together. It was definitely a trip away from the original movie, which is, again, a great movie. It's if you want to watch something scary, boy, it'll do the trick. And then a close fourth is The Omen, the original and the new one. You know, they were more or less a shot-for-shot remake. So, you know,
I've never seen either of those.
It's not the most exciting horror thing that you could conceive of.
Right.
It's definitely a slow burn, and it's based more because it's based more on a sort of biblical interpretation of things than, you know, the horror is very low key, and all the things that happen to people in that movie is very coincidental. You know, like, oh crap, you know, the top of the church got struck by lightning, and now the lightning rod has fallen off and impales a guy. You know, weird, like, that's unbelievable. Yeah, because it's supposed to be like Jesus or something doing this,
right.
you know. But what was interesting though is because like I'm kind of a fan of stuff relating to the Antichrist mythology and stuff like that. So The Omen was a fun movie, and there's a lot of disturbing things in it, like, you know, the babysitter in the beginning, you know, it's all for you, Damien, it's all for you, and she hangs herself, and you're like, what the hell was that? And why is that for him? Like, you know, you're his nanny. Like, he probably needs you to take care of him. Stupid. You know, like, why'd you kill yourself? You know?
You're terrible at babysitting.
Yeah, you know, you are not doing a good job.
You brought up when you were talking about The Exorcist, the based on a true story thing. And, like, there was an exorcism movie that was released maybe just a couple years ago. And I remember the trailers that said based on true events. I was like, that I don't think it is.
Yeah,
I don't think this actually happened.
I've read the reports.
The way you're telling it.
I've read the reports from the firemen and the policemen who were present during the exorcism that took place on the little boy that The Exorcist is based on. And, you know, I don't want to say that the priests and the firemen and the cops are beyond reproach, but I do think that they had no reason to embellish this idea at the time. They had no idea that this was going to be adapted to film and become a phenomenon. Especially at the time, you know, the idea of saying that, you know, that we saw, you know, writing on the kid's skin, you know, saying help me, and, you know, that objects flew across the room and odd things like that, you know. I say odd things like that, like it's just weird, you know. So like, holy shit, you know, like, you know, if your bookshelf or your weird moose glasses flew out of the case, it wouldn't be like, that's odd. It would be like, sweet shit, run.
Yeah, we wouldn't be in here long.
Yeah, it would just be flee. But yeah, you know, like when you read the accounts of the men that were there and saw it, and, you know. And again, I don't want to say that their testimony is beyond reproach, but they had no reason to say these things and expect to keep their jobs, you know? I mean, and so just the fact that they did was enough for me to kind of go, I don't believe in this sort of thing, but that doesn't mean that it's not true, you know. There's layers of everything, and just because I can blanketly go, nah, you know, I don't buy it, you know, doesn't mean that there wasn't something very, very wrong with this kid. Yeah. And so, you know, when I watched it, and of course, you know, seeing that it was based on a true story. As soon as I watched it, I remember going, I have to know what the real story was, because this is insane. And so that was, you know, that became like an obsession, was to find out what the real story was. And eventually I was able to get my hands on reports of you know, things that had gone on, and testimony and things like that. And to read those sorts of things and be like, wow, that is insane. Like, you know, like I don't know if I buy it, but I believe that these people are telling the truth. I don't necessarily believe that the events happened, but I believe that they believe they did. Yeah, and that's good enough. Yeah. You know.
Well, in that same vein, and one of the other movies I was going to bring up was the Blair Witch Project. Yeah. When that phenomenon happened, this was the beginning of the internet.
That was awesome.
It was. I still insane.
Remember. Yeah, I remember just the joy of that first explosive viral marketing that, I mean, it had never been done. No one expected it, and it came, and it was like aliens had dropped on the White House lawn and said, "We're here."
Yeah.
You know, like that movie changed everything. And what was so insane was like 2 years later, you're seeing that same girl in Steak and Shake commercials. And you're like, what the hell? You're the Blair Witch girl. Why are you on Steak and Shake commercials?
What I want to know is why during this whole time that, I mean, there was probably, so like the movie came out and then 3 weeks later, the Heather Donahue girl is on the Tonight Show or Letterman or something, right? But in that amount of time, at first I was hearing, oh, this is found footage. This is all legit. And then it's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. I'm like, and I still have my doubts. So time I'm like, that could have happened.
Yeah.
You know, I'm 19, whatever.
Yeah.
And finally, it dawned on me then later. I'm like, why didn't somebody just say, hey, they wouldn't have showed that in the theater if those people really died. Yeah. Like, that's the only answer to this question.
Yeah.
Like, nobody ever said that to me, and that never occurred to me.
Yeah, it never... Because when we saw it the first time, we saw a bootleg at Jack's with Rob.
I remember that.
And it was the worst, like, you couldn't see anything, and, like, you were getting a headache because it was so blurry.
Turns out it wasn't that much different than the real one.
Very true. But the crazy thing though, like the tent scene where all the hands start, and we're all like, oh my God, we're like, this is crazy. It was so perfect. It was one of those movies that will, I hope that it's one of those movies that will get a revival, not a reboot, but a revival. Like, I really hope that someone says, hey, you know what? You remember when we were all really dumb to this internet thing, and these crazy assholes made this movie that made us all think that this shit was for real. Like, let's just enjoy the hell out of this for a week. Yeah. I would love that.
It's hard to do now, but at the time, man, it was just that perfect storm.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most successful films of all time.
Yeah.
Because of how cheap it was to make and how big of a sensation it was. And I mean, honestly, the horror of it, the story of it is pretty good. Yeah. Still, it's all the unknown. You never see the monster ever. You never see it. Yeah. And it's I don't know. It's one of my favorites, and I'm admittedly not a huge horror guy, but I definitely like that.
Yeah, I enjoy. I mean, there's a lot of genres. I mean, especially for horror films, like there's slashers, and like I was a big fan of House of a Thousand Corpses when it came out, and I remember seeing it for the first time with a full theater, and by the time the movie was done, there was literally like 6 people left in the theater because almost everyone had walked out. And, and the thing about that movie was that going into it, I knew what I was getting into. Like I wasn't expecting a scary movie. I was expecting a slasher movie. And, that's a whole different thing. And so then later on, when Devil's Rejects came out, I was so happy. I was like, thank God we get these guys again, and then I watched that movie thinking I'm getting a slasher movie, and instead I got like this weird hybrid of Last House on the Left and, some kind of crazy, Hills Have Eyes kind of hybrid, where by the time that movie was over, I was like, I need a shower, and like I love that movie because it did that. The first one was just a blast. It was silly. It was goofy. The ending had made no sense whatsoever. It just sort of flew off into insanity. But it was a blast, and it gave us Captain Spaulding and and Otis and Baby, and it was so cool. And so then when Devil's Rejects happened, and it was like, hey, here's Otis and Baby and Spaulding, and I was like, man, I am a happy son of a bitch. And then when the time that movie was over, I was like, oh my God, this is Jesus Christ, and I was blown away because I'd never watched a movie except for maybe the original Last House on the Left that had kind of done something like that. I don't know, you may or may not have seen it, but the original Last House on the Left, there's a whole scene where the sort of killers have this girl out in the woods, and they're basically torturing her, and they're basically making her piss herself, and they're forcing her to do all these things, on threat of getting cut up or shot, what have you. And it was just, and I just remember it being a gross thing to watch, but knowing that this was Craven's first movie, and going, Craven's, he's never really failed me,
right?
Even if you go back to Serpent in the Rainbow, as crazy as that one was, I read the book, and that book was insane.
Yeah.
So seeing the movie wasn't all that crazy. It was just like, wow, this is great. And then of course Friday the 13th, or Freddy Krueger, Nightmare, and all that stuff, and eventually Scream, and which I thought was a disappointment. But I don't want to say anything bad about it because there's someone who will be angry. But but my beef with Scream is that I felt like it was a parody.
It almost was.
Yeah.
It almost completely was. It still had enough homage to the horror genre, and specifically that slasher genre, that it was perfect. But the cool thing about it, I guess, I just watched this recently again, and did this thing where I was like, why did I ever not know what was going on in this movie? Why did this blow my mind so much when I saw this originally? I didn't like it nearly as much, and I can't really put my finger on why, but to me, everything seemed so contrived, and everything was kind of stone and wooden, and I don't know. The best part of it was Matthew Lillard, just being Matthew Lillard. I don't know, but the whole breaking down the scary movie trope thing, I think, was way ahead of its time. I think that's something you'd see now, and we take that for granted. We're fans of Community. That whole meta. This is what happens in a sitcom episode. Here it is.
Bit by bit by bit.
Yeah, you just told us the entire story of this episode, and we're still laughing at everything. I think it was ahead of its time, and I think the writing was good. But just now going back and watching it, I'm like, this is obvious.
Yeah, I have a hard time with, was it Neve Campbell?
Yeah.
I think I have a hard time with her. I've seen her, I saw her in a ballerina movie that was amazing. But for some reason, I have a hard time with her in that movie. I just don't buy her. But I admit that could be some kind of bias that I'm just not aware of offhand. But I just remember seeing the movie, in the big group that we used to all go see movies in, and I remember really kind of being disappointed that it was a 1 Degree movie. It doesn't stray from real life at all. It was just kind of a consistent series of setups, and then knocking it out of the park just over and over and over again, and all these scenes working out too perfectly for the killer. and everything falling into place perfectly for this bad guy over and over and over again.
Right.
And being like, you know, like even Freddy Krueger would have a screw up now and again.
Yeah.
You know, like, but this guy was just nailing it on the head every time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was almost no sense that this guy isn't in complete control over every scenario. And, you know, but, you know, I won't say it's a bad movie. I just think that, you know, for me, it felt a little too much like a parody, you know. And then, of course, when I said that the other night, what I got was Scary Movie was the parody. And my reaction was, no, Scary Movie was blaxploitation. Like, you know, modern blaxploitation movie, you know, like it was more like I'm going to get you sucker than it was, you know, like Scream. You know, it was just so stupid. I mean, but it, you know, that those movies did give us Anna Farrell or whatever. Ferris, yeah.
They did.
And, you know, so thank you for those for those movies, but on the other hand, to hell with you for those movies, you know.
Yeah. Well, so that's horror.
Yep, I think that we've covered it from top to bottom. There's really no reason to go elsewhere.
I agree.
This is the definitive everything about horror.
You'll never hear anything else about horror than what you heard tonight, or today, or whenever you're listening.
Yeah,
to this.
whenever you're listening. Yeah, I think that we really knocked it out of the park.
I agree. Well, we appreciate everybody giving us a listen, giving us a watch on YouTube. Again, I wanted to hype up the website real quick one more time. It's FridayNightWrites.net. Stop by and see what we're up to. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/FNWrites. And we'll post more information about podcasts coming up and everything like that. We got a few ideas for things we're going to work on here.
A couple of special guests and,
some guests and stuff. So we're still working all that stuff out, and once we get some more information on that, we will let everybody know. But thanks a lot for listening.
Have a good one, everybody.
She's the kind of girl you dream of keeping hold of. Better forget it. Ooh, you're